JAT Chat, presented by the Journal of Athletic Training, the official journal of the National Athletic Trainers Association. I'm Dr. Shelby Baez, an assistant professor in the Department of Exercise and Sports Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and the co-host of JAT Chat with Dr. Kara Radzak. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Ms. Dana White. Ms. White is a registered dietitian nutritionist, certified athletic trainer, and clinical associate professor of athletic training and sports medicine at Quinnipiac University. She's a co-author of Interassociation Consensus Statement on Sports Nutrition Models for the Provision of Nutrition Services from Registered Dietitian Nutritionists in Collegiate Athletics. That was a mouthful, but I'm really excited to be able to talk with you today about this article. And thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Shelby. Thank you for having me. You did a great job. That is a mouthful for sure.
And so just starting off, what led to the development of this consensus document?
So this has been years in the making, dare I say over a decade in the making. This was really, the idea behind this was the brainchild of one of our authors, Victoria Lambert. She started off with Jennifer Ketterly and Amy Culp years ago in the idea of developing a document like this. As time went on, myself as well as other authors were brought in. So, from start to finish, I've lost track of how many years, but the authorship team that is responsible for publication, we've been working diligently for the last nearly 5 years in really making this come together. And really, the goal, one of the major goals we had was to truly define who we are as sports dietitians. Sport RDNs is the term that we use throughout the paper, so I'll try to keep consistent with that. And really a really unified stance on how to help clinicians get into more sports nutrition in the collegiate setting, how to help further develop existing programs or any sort of however sports nutrition services were being offered, to help expand those, to help develop them where they were needed, and providing an evidence-based cohesive document that we had all parties weigh in on to focus on that interdisciplinary approach to healthcare that we all know is so important in patient care. So again, long-winded here, but really it started out quite a long time ago through a group of very dedicated sports dietitians who work in a variety of disciplines that said, we want to create more structure in this space.
So I really, really enjoyed reading this consensus document. And one of the things you just alluded to as well, but also spent some time defining in the document, was what a sports RDN is. So I was curious if you could just describe for us, who is a sports RDN? What do they do? What are the different educations, credentials, and just give our listeners some understanding there.
I feel like certainly the athletic trainers that I work with and other healthcare providers that I work with are familiar with a registered dietitian. But the profession itself is moving more towards the credential of RDN, registered dietitian nutritionist, really because, nutritionists are not dietitians, right? So all dietitians are nutritionists, but we do see other so-called experts, may I say, out there maybe using that term nutritionist. So the profession of dietetics is really moving towards an RDN credential, to, again, make sure that there's value in that and that people are going to the evidence-based practitioner in order to get, in this case, sports nutrition services, but really throughout dietetics. So much like other disciplines, when we look at dietitians, there are areas of specialization. So this idea of the sports RDN, so that qualified, credentialed, registered dietitian nutritionist, but has that additional training that falls within very specific scope of practices as set out by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics to cover clinical sports nutrition and medical nutrition therapy and things that are designed throughout the paper, really trying to define the type of clinicians that sports RDNs are. So there are certification. So the one for sports dietitians is called the CSSD, which is a credential specific to sports dietetics, where it's really the reflection, that certification of that additional training that dietitians get that want to pursue careers or want to work in that space. Really. So, and we tried really hard to work on some of the tables and infographics in that paper to really lay out the differences between the two. So that kind of self-described nutritionists that not necessarily have those proper credentials, right? I think as athletic trainers, we've encountered that throughout our career as well. People not necessarily understanding exactly what goes into our credentials. So we see that in dietetics as well. Then, the RDN, the registered dietitian nutritionist, and what those foundational skill set and kind of, educational requirements are. And then that CSSD, which is certified specialist in sports dietetics. So, not all sport RDNs have CSSD. Many do. And we kind of break down the different criteria of really what you want to see in a qualified clinician that is working in clinical sports nutrition like we want at the collegiate level.
So you mentioned some of the infographics, and another one of the infographics that I saw in this paper was describing different levels of practice. So competence, proficient, and expert. Can you just elaborate a little bit more on those different levels? And then how should institutions consider these levels in the hiring process?
We look at it, yes, the competent, proficient, and expert. And obviously there's a connection to years of experience that go into that as well. And so we kind of lay out competent as, they've qualified, certified as a registered dietitian. They're starting to get off their experience. They have more than 3 years of experience, in sports nutrition. And then we kind of build from there. So when we see that sort of proficient clinician, they obviously have more years of that kind of specialty experience under their belt, and they demonstrate additional skills and knowledge within clinical sports nutrition. They may or may not, again, that CSSD is something that we want to see. It may or may not be for depending on the clinician. And then we get into that kind of expert range, right? And the way that we kind of put it on the paper, I'm going to read you directly. It says, RDN has a high degree of professional autonomy and responsibility in specialty area and practice. And I think that's really where that would be more when we look further into the paper at the specific models that we lay out. It really kind of shows where where you might find these players depending on the staffing, depending on the program, where you might have, someone that has more of that expert status, and then some of those other proficient and competent, RDNs working alongside them and underneath them.
So you just alluded to some of these different models. It was a great segue to my next question about the paper. Here are the different models. And just curious if you could just elaborate on these different models for our listeners.
Sure. So in addition to kind of laying out all the different things that sports RDNs do and really, our kind of, our different areas of expertise. And we can talk about that later if you want, but that was really kind of what drove these models and also realizing that all different institutions have different resources, different structures, but we wanted to offer these opportunities where we could show not only the value and importance, but the roles that those sports RDNs can play in the different variety of settings, resources, size of the school, number of student athletes, so on and so forth. So we really basically did it in a 4-pronged manner where we had the model of a part-time clinician and what they would be responsible for, then a full-time clinician, so that one full-time practitioner that was there to work with the athletes. Then to broaden that out, again, depending on all of those factors, we would look at something more like a program structure and then a department structure. And, obviously the resources, the number of staff members and really the services that could be provided would expand accordingly, right? And you see that kind of foundational core no matter what, that we would be providing these qualified medical nutrition therapy, clinical services, to the athletes, and then depending on these different models, how those might be able to grow, right? So, even if you look in a part-time size, we talk about supplement safety, right? So just as an example, you're going to see that kind of throughout of the models, but so we have these kind of foundational groups of responsibilities and things that we would want to see in all of the models. And then those expansions grow when you have more resources and more bodies. But again, also catering to the increased number of athletes that you would most likely see in a larger program, for example.
Yeah, so along those lines, just listening to the different models that are available, what have been the barriers as a sports RDN that you've identified with? Is it education to athletes, education to coaches? What are some of the barriers that you've experienced?
Well, I think, truthfully, I think a lot of it is maybe a lack of understanding about all the services that sports RDNs offer. And that, that I don't say that, in a bad way. It's not, it is maybe just the way that essentially we're perceived, and to show all the different ways that we can help in optimizing the care for student athletes. And so, money is always a barrier. Resources are always a barrier. So, that goes without saying. But I think additionally, just, we really wanted to create this document so that it is something that you could take to administration and show them, not only like the value in having a sports RDN on your team, but all the different ways that they can help benefit the entire athletic program, really. So, the idea is that I think could be different hurdles depending on the structure. But, as we all know, even as athletic trainers, I always find myself in my athletic training hat and my sports RDN hat, and there's a lot of similarities, but I think, that value of that interdisciplinary approach to healthcare is obviously what we all want for our student athletes. And we really wanted to provide really tangible explanations and examples of why it's important and how it can be done in an efficient and effective manner.
Yeah, I can definitely empathize with having to put on your athletic training hat. So for me, it's my sports psych hat. So I totally get having to shift back and forth. One of the things that you all did a really good job that I really enjoyed reading about was the evidence and minimal standards for nutrition services. And I think one of the things you all identified and discussed was this idea that our athletes are protected from risk factors associated with metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease, which when you take a step back, you're like, oh, but they're high functioning, physically active humans. You think that they wouldn't be at risk for these different things. But you all identified that potentially that may not be the case. So I was curious if you could just briefly discuss what we know about these risk factors as it relates to metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease in this population, and what role do sports RDNs play in in helping to reduce some of these concerns?
Okay, absolutely. So, and really, I'm so glad that this stuck out to you, and that's really kind of how we tried to organize the paper. So we put under clinical sports nutrition several different kind of avenues. So one being metabolic health, which we can, and cardiovascular function, which we're going to talk about. And then we, then went on to things like eating disorders and disordered eating behavior. And then we tried to kind of wrap it up and say, okay, here's the minimal standard that we want to see in this space. And then we kind of moved on to other areas like performance nutrition and food service management. And again, all those really big overarching areas that we see sports RDNs playing an important role. So yeah, specific to the metabolic health, I think, most of the data that exists is in football. And I think that's definitely a good place to start. And we need more research kind of looking at other high level athletes as well. But really looking at the fact that many of these student athletes do present with things like, altered glucose tolerance or pre-hypertension, full-on hypertension, showing, real markers. Again, that impaired glucose tolerance is is a big surprising one. And just looking at that, even just coming in, this is what we're seeing. we see it. We definitely see it with linemen, but it's not just with linemen, right? Again, that's what some of the data is also suggesting. So really calling out an important need for, despite the high functioning level of these athletes, that focusing on nutrition related outcomes and kind of real, what we call medical nutrition therapy, to not only help their short-term health in this space, but long-term health in terms of cardiovascular function, predisposition to developing type 2 diabetes and things like that. So we go on in the paper to discuss, so it's as much as a third of the athletes that have been identified in some of the data looking at getting insufficient amounts of omega-3s, for example, those omega-3 fats that are vital for cardiovascular health. Again, that's just another piece. And I think it really shows. So we've identified that these athletes need something, and then that leads to the nutrition education that the sports RDNs can provide. If we look specifically at omega-3s, for example, oftentimes, again, we're going to talk about food sources of omega-3s, but also potentially a fish oil supplement. And again, you see that important. So it just kind of leads to this progression of all of these areas, because when it comes to supplement safety, the sports RDN is the expert in that space as well. So starting with everything from the beginning thoughts of protecting long-term cardiovascular health, we get all the way to supplement safety in that same conversation when we're talking about trying to protect the safety, well-being of our athletes, from that healthcare, from that health perspective, and then also for things like supplement safety and things like that.
Yeah, well, what I keep just kind of hearing and thinking about over and over again is this idea of making sure we're treating our athletes as humans and making sure that we're treating patients and our athletes from a holistic perspective and not just understanding maybe their physical health and well-being from a functional standpoint, but also understanding the roles that nutrition plays, the roles that psychology plays, the roles that so many of these other domains play into making sure that we can provide the best patient care for our patients and our athletes. Because as I mentioned, that stat that you mentioned about metabolic syndrome and cardiovascular disease was quite stunning when I reflecting on that. So I guess that leads me to my next thought, and just kind of wanted to talk about one, from a rehabilitation standpoint as an athletic trainer with injured athletes, how do we see sports RDNs coming into that role, and what are some ways that we can integrate a sports RDN to help improve our patients and their care?
There's so many opportunities to do this, really. And I think personally, I do see athletes, maybe even the athletes that maybe weren't so interested in nutrition, if they're injured, all of a sudden, again, that kind of mindset of wanting to get back, wanting to get better, maybe even piques their interest at that point. But I think it really is a 360-degree sort of perspective of where nutrition can help them, whether it's working on their relationship with food, helping that athlete that thinks that they're injured and they don't have to eat, right? And then their healing is slowed, and we don't want that, right? So it's really, again, that educational piece is always there. Working with the sports medicine staff. I mean, we have been able to target specific interventions to help promote healing. And again, depending on, are we talking about a bony injury? Are we talking about, head trauma? I mean, there's so many different, types of injuries and therefore different types of nutrition interventions. But again, just having that piece along with whatever rehabilitation is required. And again, the athlete doesn't need to be completely out in order for there to be that sort of intervention. So it really comes from, everything from, biochemical data. Do we need to look at lab work? Do we need to analyze, their food intake? To, the kind of meal preparation and what is being offered to them. Are they, do we have to help them navigate the cafeteria? Do we have to modify some of the training table offerings, right? So it really is this kind of global way that we can help support each other in making sure that, their hydration is adequate, that their fueling is adequate, to get them, to return to play as fast as possible, right? That's what everybody wants. And having that, again, that kind of culminating effect. Also, so that it doesn't all fall on the athletic trainer, right? Again, in looking at that specific example is, athletic trainers, as we know, they don't always have time to do it all. So this is really that opportunity where that referral can be made to that sports RDN. Again, let's get them back as fast as we can, but let's do it in an efficient way, and let the athletic trainer focus on their areas of expertise, and then let the sports RDN, work their magic as well.
Yeah, I think you just said it so eloquently that this is a clear area for ability for us to engage in interprofessional collaboration to enhance patient care when they're injured. So along the lines of nutrition education services, so let's say I'm an athletic trainer at a high school. What are some things that an athletic trainer at a high school, potentially all the way up to a D1 level, can start to do? And how can they start to integrate and find sports RDNs to help with their patients?
So I must say there are 94 citations in this paper, but I must say they are so. It really is a hit list of amazing resources for athletic trainers in any setting to really look in. Again, they want that evidence-based sort of facts. I find at the high school level, it's really the fundamentals that are the most important. We can't have you skipping meals all day. We can't have you, you can't show up for 2:00 practice and you've eaten like a Pop-Tart, this idea of really encompassing, even just setting the foundation of the value of nutrition in truly helping to fuel performance, I think is one of the most important aspects. As athletic trainers, much like sports DNs, we need to really help translate that science into practical applications for our athletes, no matter what the topic. So we've really tried to provide a lot of science here, but good, reliable resources that athletic trainers can use and then take to their athletes. Of course, too, we offer, again, just these kind of reminders of the areas where sports dietitians can be helpful. I mean, can we find someone locally with the proper credentials to come in and speak to that high school group, and things like that, even if it's just, those occasional one-offs. I have found more and more interest in athletic trainers seeking out sports RDNs in their community to come in and come in regularly and have some FaceTime with the athletes. And whether you're talking to all the athletes at once or you have the luxury of being sports specific with one particular team, there are ways that you can deliver some of that, on-site nutrition, education that can make a really big difference while setting that foundation to get those athletes to buy into the value of what sports nutrition is and how it can help them optimize their performance.
Yeah, this paper is packed with 94 references that athletic trainers can use to start to enter this space. So one of my follow-up questions to that is, what's next? Where do we go from a research standpoint? Where do we go from a clinical practice standpoint as relates in this space?
So, I think we went ahead and identified some very specific areas in the paper of where we think there could be future research. I mean, obviously, we want to see more of these models executed, at the collegiate level. And that's why it was also so important to us to work with associations, NATA, CPSDA, the Sports and Human Performance Nutrition arm of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. We really wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page in doing this. So, of course, we want to see, as we can continue to expand these services, what the outcomes of those things are, right? And then can we learn from them? Are we seeing decreases in injuries? Are we preventing them? Or are we making strides in getting in return to play faster? And so, I mean, these are pie in the sky, right? I would like to see these, but I think this idea of injury prevention and treatment, was something we identified. It was nutrition-related neuroprotection from head injuries, right? We're all talking about this, but can we start to continue to see areas where we can really start to have data to say these nutrition interventions made a positive impact, whether it be return to play, injury prevention, things like that. We also talked a little bit about gut health. Again, can we see how how can nourishing our athletes better hopefully then to other outcomes that involve, even things like anxiety and depression, right? That kind of gut brain axis. So again, is how we are helping fuel our athletes better, and then those physical outcomes, the benefits that they are reaping from them. So that's really what we're hoping for. And in addition to that, just really increasing to hope improve the quality of care that student athletes are getting when it comes to, of course, specific to sports nutrition, but also looking again at what that means for them sort of globally in terms of their performance and their overall health.
Yeah, I think you've identified some fantastic future research opportunities, and I know some of that's written in this consensus statement. So I'm excited to see some of that work come to fruition. So could you my final question is, can you just provide a take-home point about your paper for our listeners? If you want them to leave this podcast with one thing, what would that one thing be?
To spend some time in this paper and just to understand the broad expertise that sport RDNs can offer within the collegiate setting, that and really how it can help that interdisciplinary approach to healthcare that we're all looking for to optimize, the health and well-being of our student athletes. And then we really tried to break it down and say, here's all the areas where sports RDNs are really working at, in clinical sports nutrition, So I think a lot of times dietitians are thought of as, just the food service side of things. And believe me, that's a really important part of what we do. But, the real science of clinical sports nutrition and what that has to offer athletic programs is really what we want to highlight and what we spent a lot of time trying to digging into, showing some real tangible evidence-based examples of how that can be done, is being done, and can continue to evolve from here on out.
Wonderful. Well, Dana, thank you so much for joining me today. And to our listeners, this article will be available free of charge by the Journal of Athletic Training. And I highly recommend everyone go and download this manuscript when it comes out in an upcoming issue. Again, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.